They say the husband is always the last to know. I used to believe that giving a woman everything she wanted, showering her with love, attention, and loyalty, would make her grateful, make her realize just how lucky she was. But the truth is, all that devotion, it just sets you up to be taken for granted. I guess it gives her the idea that there's nothing she could do that you wouldn't overlook or forgive. I met Caroline during our freshman year at the University of Texas. We started dating early on, and before the semester ended, we were tangled up in a half-serious relationship. We had good times together, sure, but we were both still figuring things out. It wasn't until halfway through our senior year that we reconnected with some real intent. 6 months after graduation, we were married. Shortly after our wedding, my parents celebrated their 30th anniversary. At the party, I managed to pull my dad aside. I asked him how he and mom had stayed so happy for all those years, especially when so many couples couldn't seem to go a month without hitting rough waters. Dad looked at me with that wise smile of his and said, "Son, the secret is to show her every single day that you love her. Don't ever assume she just knows. Make sure she feels it, day in and day out." I took his words to heart. From that day on, I made it my mission to remind Caroline of my love constantly. I never missed a birthday or anniversary, and I even celebrated the small stuff, like the day she got her first promotion or the first time we cooked dinner together. Some people might have thought it was over the top, but to me, it was a way of showing her that she was everything to me. There were even days I'd send flowers to her office just because. My goal was simple, to make her feel cherished. But somewhere along the line, my efforts began to lose their meaning. While my dad's actions had left my mom feeling secure and valued, Caroline started to see my gestures as a sign of weakness, like I was desperate to hold on to her. And I had no idea, none at all, that things had started to change. Our careers picked up after we got married. I'd landed a solid job in sales, and she was climbing the corporate ladder at an investment firm. With all the demands that came with success, we were both putting in longer hours. Most nights, one of us would be asleep by the time the other got home. I figured that was just the price you paid to make a good life, and I believe Caroline saw it that way too. Whenever we did get time together, I tried to make it count. She'd tell me I was the only man she'd ever want, and I took her word for it. I believed her because, well, why wouldn't I? But I was about to get the shock of my life. One December night, Caroline's company threw their annual holiday party. It was held at some upscale hotel downtown, and she'd arranged for us to meet there after I dropped off a client at the airport. I was supposed to arrive around 8:30, but the client's flight got delayed. By the time I finally made it to the hotel, it was only about 7:45, much earlier than Caroline expected. When I walked into the ballroom, I saw her almost right away, standing close to a man I didn't recognize. They looked pretty comfortable together, too comfortable. I watched as she wrapped her arm around his waist, and that's when I decided to follow them. They headed out of the ballroom and down a hallway that branched into a few rooms. I tried to keep up without being noticed, but they disappeared behind one of the doors before I could get close enough to see which one. I was about to leave when I heard a laugh, a soft, familiar sound coming through the ceiling vent in the hallway. I froze, realizing I could hear what was happening inside the room through the vent. That's when I heard Caroline's voice, clear as day. "Easy there. You don't want to ruin your suit, do you?" she teased. Then, another voice, a man's voice, responded, "Well, how else am I supposed to reach you from here?" Caroline laughed again and said, "Let me help you." My blood ran cold. My heart was pounding, but I stayed where I was, straining to catch every word. I could hear the rustling of clothes, a quiet laugh, and then a familiar murmur. "Derek," she said softly, "I could stare at you all night." A few seconds later, I heard a zipper. Then Caroline's voice again, murmuring, "You know, I'll never get tired of this." Her tone was playful but full of longing. Derek? Huh? I'd never heard her mention anyone by that name. The thought of barging into the room crossed my mind, but I stopped myself. If I made a scene now, it'd be my word against hers, and she'd probably find some way to twist things. No, I needed to play this smarter. If I confronted them, I might never get the full story. So, I decided to gather more information. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. I slipped out of the hotel and made my way back to the ballroom. where I found Caroline at a table with a few of her coworkers, chatting and laughing like she hadn't just been in the arms of another man. When she spotted me, she got up, throwing her arms around me and leaning in for a kiss. I turned my face just slightly so her lips brushed my cheek instead. "Not feeling great, babe," I said. "Wouldn't want to pass anything along to you." She looked at me, confused, and introduced me to the rest of the table. One of the men, Jack, gave me a firm handshake. He was tall, with dark hair slicked back and a smile that seemed a little too rehearsed. We made small talk with her colleagues, but my mind was elsewhere. Caroline kept glancing at me, sensing something was off, but she played along. When we danced, she leaned in, whispering, "Hope you're feeling up to a little fun tonight." I just nodded, letting her think everything was still fine. When we returned to the table, another man joined us, Derek. He looked shorter than me, around 5 feet 9 inches with neatly combed blonde hair and a cocky smirk. Caroline introduced him casually, as if he was just another colleague. They exchanged glances, but I kept my expression blank. After a few minutes, Derek excused himself to speak to someone at another table. Caroline turned to me and said, "I need to freshen up." She disappeared down the hallway, and moments later, I saw Derek follow her. As they slipped away, one of the women at the table caught my eye and gave me a strange smile, like she knew something I didn't. I filed that away for later. If Caroline's affair was an open secret around here, finding proof would be easier than I thought. She returned to the table, her smile as bright as ever, and leaned close to me. "Ready to head home?" she whispered. "I need you tonight." We'd driven separately, so I told her to head out first. I took my time, wanting her to be waiting when I arrived. But when I got home, I headed straight to the bathroom, claiming I had food poisoning and couldn't risk making her sick. She looked disappointed but didn't press it. That night, lying in bed, I felt a dark satisfaction settle over me. I had her right where I wanted, and she didn't suspect a thing. I wasn't going to confront her yet, not until I had all the pieces in place. Caroline thought she was in control, but she had no idea what was coming. After that night, I kept things cool. I didn't let Caroline see even a hint of the anger simmering beneath the surface. I was careful too, watchful without letting on. I went about my routines, went to work, came home, kissed her on the cheek, and acted like I didn't have a care in the world. But I was gathering intel every chance I got. It didn't take long to notice certain patterns. Caroline's late nights at the office fell on the same 2 days every week, Mondays and Thursdays. She told me once that Mondays dragged because they were wrapping up weekend issues, and Thursdays were all about finishing reports before the weekend. It had always made sense, and I never questioned it. I'd been blind to the truth for years. That first Thursday after the company Christmas party, I decided to test a theory. I waited until about 9, then sent her a text saying I'd be going to bed early. She replied with the same excuse she always used, "Just wrapping up this project. I'll be home in an hour." I didn't respond. Instead, I grabbed my keys and drove down to her office, parking about a block away. I watched the building, keeping my eye on the side door where she usually came out. At 10:05, she finally walked out, but she wasn't alone. Derek was with her, the two of them laughing as they strolled to her car. I watched as he kissed her on the cheek, his hand resting just a bit too low on her back. My fists clenched, but I stayed where I was, biding my time. They parted ways, Caroline heading to her car and Derek turning back toward the building. She drove off, and I followed her at a distance, keeping my headlights low. She didn't go home. She drove to a cheap, out-of-the-way motel on the edge of town. I parked across the street, watching as she got out, looked around, and walked up to room 213. She didn't knock, didn't hesitate, just went right in like she owned the place. I sat in my car for a long time, breathing slow and deep, feeling the anger settling into something colder, more calculated. This wasn't a game for her. This was real, and she didn't even care if I found out. I drove home with a plan forming in my mind. I knew I couldn't confront her yet. She'd lie, gaslight me, make me look like a paranoid fool. No, I needed proof, something undeniable. And once I had it, I'd destroy everything she'd built with her lies. That weekend, I got up early Saturday morning, saying I had a work meeting. Caroline barely stirred as I left the house. I didn't have a meeting. I had something better in mind. I drove across town and rented a small storage unit under a fake name, paying in cash. I stocked it with a few essentials: camera equipment, a burner phone, a laptop, and enough tools to capture everything she tried to keep hidden. I wanted my own little war room, a place I could go without her ever knowing. The next Monday, I called in sick. Caroline left for work at her usual time, completely oblivious, and I waited until she was well on her way before heading out myself. I parked near her office, took out the camera, and positioned myself in the lot. I knew she'd be able to spot my car, so I had a buddy's truck I borrowed for the day, something she'd never recognize. I sat there, waiting. Sure enough, around 7 p.m., I spotted her leaving the office. And she wasn't alone. Derek was with her, laughing like they didn't have a care in the world. I snapped a few pictures as they walked together to her car, watching as they got in and drove off. I followed, careful to keep my distance. They drove out to the same motel as before, pulled into the lot, and parked close to the same room, right up front like they didn't think anyone was paying attention. I parked down the street, zooming in as they entered the room. I watched as the light flickered on, just enough to make out their shadows against the curtains. I stayed there, watching until I couldn't take it anymore, then drove back to my storage unit. I uploaded the photos, scanned through them, and felt a twisted satisfaction growing inside me. I finally had something on her. It wasn't everything, but it was enough for a start. I began making a habit of these sick days. Every Monday and Thursday, like clockwork, I'd follow Caroline and Derek, snapping pictures and keeping records. It was a slow burn, but I wanted every angle, every moment of her betrayal documented. I wanted to make sure there was no room for her to twist her way out of this. One Thursday evening, about 2 months into my research, I decided to get a closer look. I'd been watching them come and go, seeing the same tired motel over and over. I knew that room 213 well enough that I could map out every detail in my mind. This time, I crept up to the room and got close enough to listen at the door. I could hear them inside, laughing softly, her voice teasing and light, like she hadn't a single care in the world. It was taking everything I had to stay quiet, to hold back. Hearing her laughter, knowing she was in there with him, it felt like a knife twisting in my chest. But I knew I had to stick to the plan. This wasn't the time to lose control. When I got home that night, Caroline was already back. She was lounging on the couch, acting like she hadn't just spent hours with another man. I walked in, my face a mask of calm, and she looked up, smiling that familiar smile of hers. "How was your day?" she asked casually, flipping through a magazine like nothing was wrong. I forced a smile. "Fine. Just fine." Inside, the rage was simmering, but I pushed it down. Soon enough, she'd see just how fine things really were. That weekend, I spent hours in my storage unit, planning every detail. I had enough to confront her, sure, but that wasn't enough. No, I wanted to hit her where it hurt, to make her feel every ounce of betrayal she dealt me. And I knew exactly where to start. By the time February rolled around, I had more than enough evidence to prove Caroline's betrayal. My phone and laptop were filled with photos, timestamps, and notes detailing every late-night meeting with Derek. Each snapshot, each recording felt like another nail in the coffin of what used to be our marriage. But I wasn't ready to confront her just yet. I knew that if I wanted this to hit her hard, I had to make sure there was no escape for her, no way to talk herself out of it. I wanted her to feel the full weight of what she'd done, and I wanted her world to crumble just as mine had. One Friday night, as Caroline went on about her big project deadline and how she'd need to spend some extra hours over the weekend, I gave her an understanding nod, the same one I'd been giving for months. "Take all the time you need, babe," I said. She smiled, oblivious to the fact that I'd already mapped out her weekend with Derek. The following day, I took a bold step. I contacted an old friend, Mike, who ran a small private investigation firm. Mike and I had gone way back, working side by side in sales before he took his PI license and turned to tracking down leads of a different kind. I hadn't told anyone about Caroline, but if there was one person I could trust, it was Mike. I filled him in on the situation, sharing a few photos and the details I'd gathered. "Man, that's rough," he said, flipping through the evidence. "You sure you want to go through with this? Once it's out there, There's no turning back. I nodded. I've got nothing left to lose, Mike. I need to see this through. He agreed to help me, and together, we mapped out a plan. Mike suggested I record a few more incriminating moments to have an airtight case. With his resources, he could even pull some of Derek's background information, giving us a broader picture of who Caroline was risking everything for. The next Thursday, I took my usual position near the motel, camera ready. Caroline and Derek arrived as usual, completely unaware that I was snapping photos from a distance. As they entered the room, I crept closer, close enough to hear bits of their conversation through the thin motel walls. They talked about work, laughed about inside jokes, and then the conversation shifted. "I can't keep doing this forever," Derek murmured. "What if your husband finds out?" Caroline laughed softly, brushing it off. "Please. He's so clueless. He wouldn't notice if we were right in front of him." The anger bubbled up again, but I kept my cool. Hearing her dismiss me like that made me more determined than ever. She thought I was oblivious, that I'd never put two and two together. Well, that was about to change. The following week, Mike got back to me with Derek's file. Turns out, Derek had more to hide than a secret affair. He'd been caught embezzling funds from a previous job, only managing to stay out of prison by settling out of court. The case had been quietly dismissed, but Mike had access to old records, and he handed me everything I needed. Armed with this information, I finally felt like I had an edge, a way to hit both of them where it would hurt the most. Over the next few days, I quietly began pulling things together. I contacted a lawyer to start the process of dividing assets, taking care to keep things discreet. If Caroline caught wind of my moves too soon, it might give her a chance to turn things around on me. I needed her caught off guard, completely blindsided. The night before I planned to set everything in motion, I went through the house, room by room, picking up anything that mattered to me. Most of it was sentimental stuff. A few old photos, gifts from family members, and a couple of things that reminded me of better days. I packed them up and took them to a friend's place, just to make sure they'd be safe. I knew once the storm hit, there'd be no telling what she'd try to take with her. Then, on Thursday morning, I woke up before dawn and left without a word. I didn't want to face her. I didn't want to give her the chance to see the anger boiling just beneath the surface. By the time she left for work, I was already at Mike's office, finalizing the details of our plan. "You sure you want to do it this way?" Mike asked, handing me the last of the documents. "It's gonna be a hell of a blow." "That's the idea," I replied. "She's earned it." With the evidence, the photos, and everything Mike had gathered, I had enough to bring her whole charade crashing down. I drove straight to her office building, parking where I could see her car, and waited. Around noon, she and Derek strolled out of the building together, chatting and laughing as they walked down the block to a restaurant. I followed at a distance, watching as they settled into a booth by the window. I dialed her office, asking to speak to her boss. "Hi, Mr. Peterson," I said, feigning casual politeness. "I'm calling on behalf of Mike Cunningham's investigation firm. I have some information regarding an employee of yours and a potential legal concern involving company property and time." There was a pause. "I'm listening," Peterson replied, sounding skeptical but interested. With that, I spilled everything. I gave him the details of Caroline and Derek's meetings, the motel visits, and even hinted at Derek's embezzlement background, suggesting it might be wise to look into company finances. I heard the irritation growing in his voice, the realization that his trusted employees were not as clean-cut as they'd appeared. By the time I hung up, I felt a sense of grim satisfaction settling over me. I knew it wouldn't take long for word to get back to them. I stayed close by, watching from my car as Caroline and Derek returned to the office after lunch, still looking oblivious to what was coming. An hour later, I saw Peterson storming out of the building, followed closely by Derek. I didn't have to hear the conversation to know how it was going. Derek's face was red, and Peterson's jaw was clenched in anger as he pointed back toward the building. Caroline followed soon after, her face pale as she walked behind them. They didn't even make it to the parking lot before she pulled out her phone and called me. "Hi, babe," she said, her voice strained. "We, had a bit of an issue at work today. Could you pick me up later?" "Oh, I'd love to, but I'm a little busy today," I replied, keeping my tone light. "Sounds like you've got bigger problems to worry about." There was a silence, and then a quick intake of breath. What are you talking about? You know exactly what I'm talking about, Caroline, I replied. I've known everything for a while now. She tried to laugh it off. Don't be ridiculous. I chuckled. I'll let you get back to handling your issue at work. I'm sure Derek can give you a ride. Without another word, I ended the call, leaving her to deal with the fallout. I knew that her boss was already setting things in motion. Disciplinary actions, a possible suspension, maybe even termination. And I could only imagine how Derek was holding up under the pressure. Later that night, I got a call from Mike. Heard from Peterson's office. Both of them are on unpaid leave until further investigation. If they find anything else, they're both out for good. Perfect, I replied, feeling the weight of victory settling over me. This was just the beginning. Caroline's lies were catching up with her, and I wasn't even done yet. Over the next few days, I made sure to keep my distance. Caroline's calls and texts came in like clockwork, first every couple of hours, then dropping off as she started to get the hint. I hadn't changed any locks, but I made sure to keep my things packed and stashed away, knowing it wouldn't be long before she tried to corner me for an explanation. By Wednesday, she finally showed up at my office. I saw her before she saw me, standing in the lobby, shifting from one foot to the other, her face a mask of frustration and anxiety. I took a deep breath, preparing myself for the encounter. Then, I walked out and met her gaze as if I hadn't a single care in the world. "Bob," she started, her voice softer than I'd heard in years, almost a whisper. "Can we talk? Just for a minute." I glanced at my watch, letting the silence stretch out before nodding. "Fine," I said, and led her down the hall to a quiet conference room. She closed the door, glancing around, like she was trying to come up with the right words. I didn't plan on giving her the satisfaction. "What's going on?" I asked, my voice flat. "Last I heard, you had a big project keeping you busy. Must have been something serious to land you on unpaid leave." Her face twisted, her eyes darting around like a trapped animal. I don't know what happened," she stammered, finally looking me in the eye. "It's just a misunderstanding at work. They think they're accusing me of things that aren't true." I raised an eyebrow, unimpressed. "Maybe you should be more careful about who you associate with. It sounds like your buddy Derek's reputation finally caught up with him, and you." She swallowed, her face reddening. "Bob, you don't understand. This isn't how it looks. Derek and it's not what you think." I laughed, a cold, bitter sound that echoed off the walls. "Oh, I think it's exactly what I think. In fact, I've known exactly what's going on for months. All the late nights, the excuses, the lies. You thought I was just too blind to see it." Caroline took a step back, her face paling. "You've known, all this time?" I nodded, feeling the weight of everything settle over me, the satisfaction of finally laying it all out in the open. "Yes, and I've got all the proof. Photos, recordings, everything I'd need to tear you apart in court if I wanted to. But don't worry, I've got better plans than that." She didn't speak, just stared at me, her mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. For once, she had no defense, no quick retort, no lie to shield her. The reality of what I'd built up over months was sinking in. "You don't have to do this," she whispered, voice trembling. "Please, we can work this out. I was stupid, I know, but we can move past this." I shook my head slowly, watching as her shoulders slumped, the defiance draining from her face. "Move past it? You want to sweep this under the rug like it never happened?" "No, Caroline. We're well beyond that point." She slumped into a chair, covering her face with her hands. For a moment, I felt the faintest hint of pity, but I pushed it aside. She'd made her bed, and now she was going to lie in it alone. I walked out, leaving her there, the door swinging shut behind me. It felt good to finally say my piece, to watch her realize the full extent of her actions. But I wasn't done. I knew that if I wanted to cut her loose completely, I'd need to deal with the last few pieces of this mess. That Friday, I decided to pay Derek a little visit. I tracked him down at a small bar on the far side of town, a dive joint I'd found out he frequented on weekends. I waited until he'd had a few drinks, watching him from a corner as he flirted with the bartender, still carrying on as though nothing in the world could touch him. When he finally stumbled out into the alley behind the bar, I followed. He barely noticed me until I grabbed his shoulder, spinning him around. "Derek," I said, my voice low and controlled. "We need to talk." His eyes went wide for a moment, recognition dawning as he took in my face. Then, a cocky smirk slid over his lips. "Oh, so you finally found out, huh?" Figures Caroline's little lapdog would come sniffing around sooner or later. My hand clenched into a fist, but I forced myself to stay calm. "I know everything," I said quietly. "And if you think this is over, you're dead wrong. You and Caroline are both going to lose everything. Your jobs, your reputations, you'll be left with nothing." He laughed, a harsh, mocking sound. "Oh, is that supposed to scare me? I've been through worse. Caroline will come back to me. She always does." I took a deep breath, my voice steady. "Not this time. I made sure of it. And by the time I'm done, you'll be a stain on the carpet of her life, nothing more." With that, I turned and walked away, leaving him swaying in the alley, the full reality of what was coming for him still sinking in. He wouldn't take it seriously, not yet, but soon enough he'd realize how wrong he was. The final piece came into play that weekend. I had my lawyer draw up the divorce papers, every detail laid out exactly as I wanted. Caroline would get nothing, no house, no savings, no alimony. The evidence I'd gathered would back up every claim I'd made, leaving her with no room to contest it. On Sunday afternoon, I left the papers on the kitchen table, right where she'd be sure to see them when she walked in. I sat on the front porch, waiting, my heart pounding with a mixture of satisfaction and finality. Caroline finally pulled up around 5, stepping out of her car with a defeated expression. She walked up to the house, her gaze downcast, and barely glanced at me as she entered. A few seconds later, I heard her gasp, the sound of the paper rustling as she picked up the divorce papers. She came back out, holding the papers in her shaking hands, her face a mixture of shock and fear. You can't do this," she said, her voice barely a whisper. I met her gaze, feeling no pity. "I already have. It's over, Caroline. You threw it all away, and now you're going to face the consequences." She stood there, staring at me, the weight of everything pressing down on her. For a moment, I thought she might fight back, argue, plead. But then, she simply looked down, defeated, and walked back inside. That night, as I lay in bed, I felt an odd sense of peace wash over me. The months of deceit, of betrayal and bitterness, had finally led to this. I'd taken control back from her, piece by piece, leaving her with nothing but the empty shell of what she tried to create. As I drifted off to sleep, I knew that I'd won. She thought she could betray me and come out unscathed, but she'd underestimated me, and now she was paying the price. The days that followed were strangely quiet. I heard nothing from Caroline, not a single call or message. I figured she was processing everything, probably consulting a lawyer, hoping to find some loophole to pull herself out of the pit she'd dug. But she didn't have a leg to stand on. My lawyer assured me the evidence I'd gathered was solid, and her attempts to salvage anything from the divorce would fall flat. One afternoon, about a week after I served the papers, Mike called me. "You won't believe it," he said, a hint of disbelief in his voice. "Heard from a mutual friend that Derek just lost his job." I felt a grim satisfaction, but I was hardly surprised. After I'd tipped off Peterson about Derek's shady history, it was only a matter of time before they found something. Embezzlers aren't usually trusted for long, once their records come out of hiding. "And that's not all," Mike continued. "Seems like his wife found out about the affair. She's left him, filed for divorce the same day." That news hit me in a way I didn't expect. Derek was getting what he deserved, just as Caroline was, but hearing how everything was unraveling for them so quickly made it all feel real. All those lies, all those secrets, everything had finally come crashing down on both of them. Over the next month, Caroline moved out of our house, quietly packing her things, barely looking at me as she went about her business. I watched her from a distance, noting the weariness in her eyes, the way her shoulders slumped as she carried boxes to her car. She'd stopped wearing makeup, and the once carefully put-together woman I'd known looked almost unrecognizable. One day, as she loaded the last box into her car, she paused, standing there for a moment, like she was about to say something. She turned to face me, her eyes searching mine, but I kept my expression blank. If she was hoping for a word of comfort, some parting gesture of forgiveness, she was out of luck. "Goodbye, Bob," she said softly, her voice barely audible. I nodded. "Goodbye, Caroline." With that, she got into her car and drove away, leaving me standing there, feeling a strange emptiness settle over me. It was done. The life we'd built, the marriage I'd cherished, the love I'd thought was real. It was all over. But as painful as it was, there was also a sense of freedom. I'd taken control back, stripped away the lies, and reclaimed my life on my terms. For the next few months, I kept mostly to myself, focusing on work and rebuilding. The house felt quieter, emptier without her, but I came to appreciate the solitude. I could move on, rebuild from scratch, and find a way to let go of everything that had happened. One night, as I was sitting on the porch with a beer, my phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. I frowned, glancing at the screen. It was a single sentence, "I'm sorry." I knew it was from Caroline. I stared at the message for a long moment, feeling a surge of anger and sadness, all mixed together. But I knew responding would give her a piece of me that she no longer deserved. I deleted the message and set my phone down, feeling a sense of finality settle over me. The last I heard, she'd moved to a smaller town, taken up a job managing a small boutique. Derek had vanished from her life, and she'd been left to pick up the pieces on her own. Part of me wondered if she ever really understood the damage she'd done, the trust she'd shattered. But that was her burden to carry, not mine. As for me, I learned to let go, to move forward, piece by piece. The scars she left were deep, but I'd survived. And for the first time in years, I felt truly free. Subscribe so you don't miss new stories on the channel.